For 11 years, Ted Sorensen was John F. Kennedy's political strategist and confidant. He helped Kennedy craft some of his most memorable lines, such as, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Sorensen also researched and co-wrote Profiles in Courage, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book that brought Kennedy national fame. But above all, Ted Sorensen was John F. Kennedy's favorite speechwriter. Kennedy's inaugural address, bright, cold day, was probably the most powerful speech of its kind in many years. You had a hand in it.
I had a hand in it.
I want to read you a few lines from it. I assume you know these lines well.
I'll correct you if you're wrong.
And I'd like you to pick them up where I leave off. And tell me some of the poetry behind the politics here, all right? We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth
from this time and place to friend and foe alike,
that the
torch has been passed to
a
a new generation of Americans
born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
So what are the literary antecedents of Kennedy's inaugural address?
I have no doubt that I was influenced by my reading of the Gettysburg Address as a boy in Lincoln, by reading other speeches of Lincoln and Jefferson, perhaps some of Winston Churchill, perhaps some from the Bible.
Sorensen, born in 1928 in Lincoln, Nebraska, grew up in the Great Depression and in the Dust Bowl days.
In Lincoln, Nebraska, the state capital, there was a wonderful statue of Abraham Lincoln. That statue of Lincoln was in front of a slab which contained the entire text of the Gettysburg Address. I read it many times.
Is that something you committed to memory?
No, I can't say I committed it to memory, but I was inspired by it. I read it often. I studied it often.
Sorensen earned a law degree and graduated from the top of his class at the University of Nebraska in 1951. Soon, he was interviewing for a staff counsel position with two freshman Democrat senators in Washington.
And those two were Scoop Jackson of Washington State and John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. I decided that Kennedy was the more interesting prospect.
Now, in 1953, Senator John Kennedy was 35 years old, and you yourself not quite 25. Young senators were to be seen and not heard in those days. How did Senator John F. Kennedy make his mark in the 1950s?
John F. Kennedy made his mark in the early 1950s in two ways. One, he was young, good-looking, glamorous, rich, a war hero, a Harvard graduate, and in his second year in the Senate, he married a beautiful, glamorous woman. So the magazines and, to some extent, the newspapers were full of stories about the glamorous young senator, most of which publicity he was not seeking and did not think was helpful. He also began drafting me to help write articles. We had an article on foreign policy in the New York Times Sunday magazine in about his second year. And late in 53, I would say, the first year, he showed me a passage in one of his favorite books about Senator John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts defying all the private interests of Massachusetts by supporting an embargo against England. JFK thought that was a great act of political courage to take on the interests of his own state, standing up for the national interest. He said, "I'd like to write an article on this subject." And keep your eyes and ears open for some other examples. And I did, and we began to acquire a little file, and after 1954, when he became increasingly active as a senator, he had to go to the hospital for a spinal operation, which came close to killing him.
So Senator Kennedy was flat on his back in the hospital, and he drafted some notes for an idea for a short piece of journalism.
Yes.
And that sheaf of notes he gave to you.
Wait a minute now, are you cleared for some of America's deepest secrets? We're getting into the authorship of Profiles in Courage. It was his book, he was the author, but I played the very full role for which he thanked me in the acknowledgments in the book.
That full role was writing.
Was what?
Writing.
It was research, it was coordination, it was pulling together material on the individual senators of the past whom he had selected to be the subject of chapters in the book.
Of course, the book, Profiles in Courage, had his name on it.
Yes.
By John F. Kennedy.
And rightly so.
And it won the Pulitzer Prize.
The following year.
But it's no great secret that your intellect, your words, were an integral part of the book.
Well, I've tried to keep it a secret.
It's not a secret at this point.
Anyway, I'm proud to say I played an important role, but not the determinant role. That was his.
So is it safe to say that John F. Kennedy was the intellectual author of the book and you put together the bricks and mortar of the book?
That's not bad.
John Kennedy began thinking about running for president in 1956. That year, he and Sorensen began touring the country, fine-tuning the senator's speeches.
Everything evolved during those 3+ years that we were traveling the country together. He became a much better speaker. I became much more equipped to write speeches for him because day after day after day after day, he's up there on the platform speaking, and I'm sitting in the audience listening, and I find out what works and what doesn't.
What do you think decided the presidential election between Kennedy and Nixon?
Television. In the first television debate, the first live debate between presidential candidates, Kennedy not only looked better and sounded better and spoke better, but he was better prepared. He was more decisive and determined in his demeanor. We didn't switch a lot of Republican votes, but Kennedy's party, the Democratic Party, was the majority party in the country. If we could only gain those Democrats who thought he was too young or too inexperienced or too Catholic.
In 1960, Kennedy triumphed in one of the narrowest presidential elections in history. He was 43 years old. Ted Sorensen, now his special counsel, was 32. Just 3 months into the Kennedy presidency came the Bay of Pigs.
He authorized the CIA he had inherited to proceed with an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles who had been organized and trained and armed by the CIA. Invasions aren't usually quiet, but he had been assured by the CIA that the people of Cuba would rise up when they got word of this, of the return of the exiles, and throw Castro out. Like most of the other assurances, that one was invalid.
The invasion was a disaster. The CIA soon was implicated in the fiasco. In the aftermath, Kennedy accepted responsibility with a phrase that is resonant.
He said that there's an old Chinese saying, success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. But at that point, he stepped up to claim parenthood, which was noble of him because the whole operation had been conceived, planned, implemented, and so on by the CIA that he had not installed, and approved by the Joint Chiefs whom he had not appointed. Washington was shocked. No president had ever taken responsibility for a fiasco and a failure, and the Bay of Pigs was both a fiasco and a failure. His ratings in the public opinion polls rose, causing Kennedy to mutter that, what other stumbles and bumbles did he have to commit to see it rise again?
18 months after the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy administration faced another great challenge in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
No one who had not lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis can possibly understand the idea that for 13 days, Armageddon felt at hand.
It was.
There came a moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis where President Kennedy had to decide whether to attack the Soviet missile bases in Cuba, whether with conventional weapons or conventional force or something worse, or whether to blockade the waters around the island. What did you witness in that decision-making moment?
Those 13 days were called by have been called by historians the most 13 dangerous days in the history of mankind, and I truly believe they were. The Soviets had secretly, swiftly rushed these nuclear weapons into Cuba. They were capable of reaching most parts of the United States, many parts of the hemisphere. We had to assume that they were being rushed in secretly under cover of deception in order to be used, either used for attack or used for nuclear blackmail, trading off Berlin or whatever. And from the first day that Kennedy called a group of us together that would later be called the XCOM, the first option was always a so-called surgical airstrike. Kennedy was great for asking questions. I wasn't too bad at asking questions myself, and questions revealed that the surgical airstrike, A, wasn't surgical at all. It necessitated all kinds of strikes the length and breadth of Cuba, and couldn't be sure that it would get, even then, would get all of the missiles, and that some of them could still be fired and kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And so the blockade option began to creep in, particularly when I was asked to try to draft a high-level emissary-delivered note to Khrushchev personally, warning him so that, at Bobby's insistence, this wouldn't be another Pearl Harbor in which bombs were dropped on a small island and innocent civilians at the site would be killed.
When you went home at night during the Cuban Missile Crisis, did you ever fear that you wouldn't see the dawn?
Frankly, during those all 13 of those 13 days, I was too busy to be scared. I was just working thinking, wondering what to do. Sometimes I continued wondering and worrying what to do when I got home at night, but I didn't know what to do.
With a naval blockade in place, the Kennedy administration began opening back channels to the Soviet Union. Sorensen was responsible for drafting messages to the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev.
I knew that any mistakes in my letter, anything that angered or soured Khrushchev, could result in the end of America, maybe the end of the world. So those thoughts were never far from my mind, but we had a president who remained very calm and cool throughout, and each time made the right decision.
Ultimately, Khrushchev declared that the missiles stationed on Cuba would be sent back to the USSR. Kennedy, in exchange, vowed not to invade Cuba and to remove American nuclear missiles in Turkey. What were you doing on November 22nd, 1963?
Oh, please, let's not talk about that. The feeling, I really don't want to go into that day, the worst day of my life. It was a feeling of hopelessness, of anger, of bitterness, that there was nothing we could do, there was nothing I could do after I'd been with him almost 11 years, always helping, always answering questions, always solving problems. I couldn't do anything. I wasn't anywhere near.
In the aftermath of the assassination, Sorensen wrote 2 popular books about his time with Kennedy. He remained deeply involved in politics, even running for Robert F. Kennedy's Senate seat in 1970. Robert Kennedy had been a United States Senator from New York. Did you feel in some way you were taking up the mantle?
Frankly, it was an act of hubris on my part. I did not know the state that well. I had no real constituency in the state. I was a failure at trying to raise money for my campaign. I learned a lot, but it's not a surprise that I lost.
In 1977, the President-elect of the United States, Jimmy Carter, hit you with a bit of a bolt from the blue, didn't he?
That is true.
He wanted you to run the CIA.
Carter asked me, and I had to make a very quick decision. I did not know whether a lawyer and a moralist was suitable for a position that presides over all kinds of law-breaking and immoral activities. But I wanted to be involved. I wanted to be back in the government at a position where I could help things in a sound and progressive way, and so I said, yes, I accept.
But the nomination was doomed. Sorensen had been a conscientious objector 30 years before, and this fact made him a bad fit in the eyes of some politicians. And the president, who had on the campaign trail denounced the CIA as a national disgrace in the event, left you twisting in the wind.
Boy, did he ever leave me twisting in the wind, and he wanted me to withdraw, and I said, not till I clear my name. I didn't want to impose myself on a reluctant agency or a reluctant Senate. That would not be good for the CIA activities in the future. So I told them that I had spoken to President-elect Carter on my way to the hearing room, and that my nomination was being withdrawn.
When the Times spoke with Mr. Sorensen in 2007, he was 79 years old. He was working on his memoirs and supporting Senator Barack Obama, then seeking the Democratic nomination for president. His eyesight had deteriorated, but he continued to often appear at speaking engagements.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Pay no attention to the fact that people had to lead me up here. I don't see much, but I have more vision than the President of the United States.
Is speechwriting a lost art?
I think that, frankly, eloquence in public speeches is a lost art, whether it comes from the mind and heart of the political leader who's speaking, or whether he has speechwriters.
Was there a trick to writing for John Kennedy?
A trick? Well, for some reason, he tried other speechwriters and none of them ever succeeded. But that was, again, I credit those 3 years of traveling across the country together and learning what worked and what he liked, what he used, so that over that long a period of time, his style and my style, his standard and my standard merged. Others didn't have that.
All of us, by virtue of our work, have a legacy we'd like to leave behind. What is yours?
Well, my parents brought me up to try to make this a better world, and I've spent most of my life trying. I had the extraordinary opportunity for 11 years to try with and through a wonderful man who shared my values and ideals, who was in a position to do something about them as President of the United States. In those 11 years, there was no moment of more importance to the world than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the moment that the President asked me to draft the letter to Khrushchev resolving the crisis. For more than 40 years after I left the White House, my law practice consisted mostly of international legal matters, and in that capacity I gave some advice and help to people like Anwar Sadat and Nelson Mandela. Even had a role in facilitating South Africa's first free